For Anne, the summer days slipped by like golden beads on the necklace of the year. And suddenly, September had come around again, yellow and glowing. But this time, Anne would not be returning to the small, safe world of Avonlea School. She was going to Queen's. She was going to study to become a teacher. She was going to have to leave Matthew and Marilla. As the train drew into Bright River Station, Matthew reached for Anne's bag. But Anne forestalled him. "I'll take it, Matthew," she said. "It'll be easier if I go quickly by myself." Marilla's eyes were suspiciously bright. Was her only comment. "Let's not get emotional over nothing." Anne put down her bag. "Nothing!" she exclaimed. "Why, you and Matthew mean everything to me." Reaching over, she leaned her soft cheek fondly against Marilla's lined one. Marilla fought back her tears. "All this foolishness," she said hoarsely, nodding in Matthew's direction. "I guess you may as well kiss him too." Anne kissed Matthew tenderly, then climbed quickly onto the train. "I'm afraid for her, Matthew," said Marilla, as the train pulled away from the platform. "She'll be gone so long. She'll get terrible lonesome." "You mean we'll get terrible lonesome," Matthew replied, putting his arm about his sister's shoulder. He took a deep breath and blinked rapidly once or twice. "Well now," he said, "that Mrs. Spencer sure made a lucky mistake all them years ago." "That wasn't luck. That was Providence," said Marilla emphatically, and this time she made no attempt to hide the tears starting into her eyes. "He knew we needed her." Anne's train arrived in Charlottetown just in time for her to attend the opening of the academy. What with meeting all the new students, learning to know the professors by sight, and being organized into classes, her first day sped by in a whirl of excitement. Miss Stacy's entire class had passed the entrance examination to the Teachers' College. Most of them had elected to take the regular course. This meant they would spend 2 years studying before obtaining a teaching certificate. Only Anne and Gilbert, on Miss Stacy's advice, had chosen to try for a first-class teacher's license in 1 year. Anne was conscious of a pang of loneliness when she found herself in a room with 50 other students, not one of whom she knew, except the tall, brown-haired boy across the room. Knowing him in the way she did was not going to help her much in terms of friendship, she reflected. Yet she was glad they were to be in the same class, for the old rivalry could still be carried on. Indeed, Anne would hardly have known what to do if it had been lacking. "Gilbert looks awfully determined," she thought to herself. "I suppose he's making up his mind here and now to win the gold medal at the end of the year. What a splendid chin he has! To think I never noticed it before." It was the first time Anne had ever been away from Matthew and Marilla for more than one night. Most of the other girls had relatives in town with whom they could live. Diana's Aunt Josephine had offered to take Anne, but her house was so far from the academy that it was out of the question. So Miss Barry had hunted up a boarding house, assuring Matthew and Marilla that it was the very place for Anne. Looking about her narrow little room, with its empty bookcase and pictureless walls, Anne couldn't help but long for her own cozy room at Green Gables. A horrible choke came into her throat as she thought of Matthew and Marilla sitting by the fire in the kitchen, and the light from Diana's window shining out through the gap in the trees. In the agony of homesickness that seized her during those first few weeks, she thought frequently of Gilbert and the friendship she had so scornfully refused. She could not help imagining that it would be very pleasant to have such a friend as Gilbert to jest and chatter with, and exchange ideas about books and studies and ambitions. The thought of such companionship so appealed to her that one night she sat down and wrote him a letter. In it she apologized for her rudeness to him and wondered politely whether from now on they could be friends. The next morning, feeling her courage already slipping, she hurried down to the men's residence at Queen's, planning to leave the letter with the hall porter. But instead of accepting the letter, the hall porter motioned Anne to the sitting room where, he said, she would find Mr. Blythe in person. Flustered, and with her heart thumping in the most uncalled-for manner, Anne approached the sitting room. There Gilbert stood, his back to the door, his elbow resting on the piano. He was gazing admiringly, or so Anne interpreted from her reading of his back, at the person seated on the piano stool. From this person's profile, Anne was also able to read volumes. She was raven-haired. She was winsome. That she was also intelligent, there could be no doubt, for even as Anne quietly entered the room, she was describing in clear, carrying tones how she intended to carry off the Avery scholarship. "Can't you just picture it, Gilbert?" she laughed, and her long, slender fingers picked out a triumphal march on the piano keys. "Emily Clay, winner of the Avery!" For one long moment, Anne stood frozen in the doorway. Then she turned and fled. As she stormed back across the quadrangle, scattering little white flecks of ripped letter in her wake, Anne was torn between tears and fury. The Avery Scholarship was one of the most prestigious scholarships in the Maritime Provinces. It meant $250 a year for 4 years at Redmond College. It meant a good university degree and a chance to make Matthew and Marilla proud of her. Besides, it was awarded for distinction in English, a field that Anne regarded as uniquely her own. Who did this Emily Clay think she was, anyway? Setting her cap at the Avery. And at Gilbert, too, for that matter. Well, she'd reckoned without Anne Shirley. Gradually, Anne's homesickness wore off. She wrote long, devoted letters to Marilla and Matthew. During the autumn and early winter, she made several weekend visits home, which helped a great deal. Gradually, too, she drew a little circle of friends around her at Queen's. But after the Christmas holidays, she threw herself into her work with even more than her customary enthusiasm and concentration. So hard did she work that by early summer, when the examination results were due out, she barely had enough energy left to care what they might be. Or at least, so she claimed to her friend, Jane Andrews. The final results of all the examinations were to be posted that morning on the bulletin board at the college, and Anne and Jane were walking down the street toward campus together. "You'll just have to read the announcements and then come and tell me, Jane," Anne decided. "And in the name of our long friendship, I implore you to do it as quickly as possible. If I have failed, just say so, without trying to break it gently. And whatever you do, don't sympathize with me. Promise me this?" But Jane's solemn promises were interrupted by the loud cheers of boys streaming down the steps from the hall where the results were posted. On their shoulders they carried Gilbert Blythe. "Hurrah!" they were yelling at the tops of their voices. "Hurrah for Gilbert Blythe, medalist!" For a moment, Anne felt one sickening pang of defeat and disappointment. So she had failed, and Gilbert had won. And then somebody called out, "3 cheers for Anne Shirley, winner of the Avery!" Then Anne, too, was the center of a laughing, congratulating group. Her shoulders were thumped, her hands shaken vigorously. She was pulled and pushed and hugged. Through it all, her one thought was of Matthew and Marilla, and how proud this news would make them. Strangely enough, of Emily Clay she thought not at all. Commencement was the next important happening. The graduation ceremony was held in the big assembly hall of the academy. Speeches were made, essays read, songs sung, and diplomas, prizes, and medals awarded. Matthew and Marilla attended the ceremony. They had eyes and ears for only one student on the platform, a tall girl in palest green, with faintly flushed cheeks and starry eyes. It was that same girl, their girl, who read the best essay and was pointed out and whispered about as the Avery winner. "Reckon you're glad we kept her, Marilla?" whispered Matthew when Anne had finished her essay. "It's not the first time I've been glad," retorted Marilla. "You do like to rub things in, Matthew Cuthbert." Anne went home to Avonlea with Matthew and Marilla that evening. The apple blossoms were out, and the world was fresh and young. In her own white room, where Marilla had set a flowering house rose on the windowsill, Anne looked about her and drew a long breath of happiness. She was back at Green Gables at last, with 3 golden months of vacation stretching before her. The very next afternoon, Anne and Diana set out for a stroll along the old birch path by the sea. Arm in arm, they talked and wandered until the sun was setting and the glimmering sea was streaked with long shivers of pink. Anne sighed in sheer contentment. "Oh, Diana, isn't that breath of mint delicious? I can't bear the thought of leaving here again." 4 years, murmured Diana in dismay. "I'll probably be old and gray by the time you come back from university." "More likely you'll be married to a dashingly handsome young man and much too busy with babies to be interested in your former bosom friend," laughed Anne. "Such as who?" wondered Diana gaily. "Moody Spurgeon, perhaps?" "I'll pray that someone wonderful comes to Avonlea and sweeps you off your feet," Anne promised. Diana's smile faded. "Gilbert Blythe is getting Avonlea school, Anne." Anne felt a sudden little sensation of dismayed surprise. She had expected Gilbert would be going to college too, just like herself. "His father can't afford to send him to Redmond," Diana was saying. "He's going to have to earn his way by teaching." Anne wondered what she would do without their inspiring rivalry. She was afraid everything, even studying for a real degree, would seem flat without her friend the enemy. "I wish him luck," she said finally. "He's a talented and determined young man." Diana's expression was odd. "You mean—" She hesitated, looking down at the daisy she was holding. "Do you mean that, as far as you're concerned, he's fair game?" Anne stared at her friend in astonishment. "Why, Diana Barry! If you were interested in Gilbert Blythe, why on earth didn't you ever say so?" "Because I thought my bosom friend was in love with him," replied Diana quietly. It came to Anne then that she was not the only person who had grown up in the past year. Almost shyly, she reached over and kissed Diana on the cheek. "Good night, sweet Diana," she said, before turning back toward Green Gables. Diana returned her smile. "Good night, Anne," she replied affectionately. The following evening, Anne went with Matthew to fetch the cows from the back pasture. The woods were all gloried through with sunset, and the warm splendor of it streamed down through the hill gaps in the west. Anne's thoughts were absorbed in the beauty of the twilight. Behind her she could hear Matthew urging on Buttercup, who always dallied. Suddenly he gave a stifled cry and a gasp. Anne looked back. Matthew had fallen to the ground. She flew to his side. "What is it? What is it, Matthew?" she cried, alarm in every jerky word. He lay still. Dropping to her knees, she gathered his head onto her lap. His face was strangely drawn and gray. "Matthew, please, Matthew," She felt helpless, bewildered. "I'll go get the doctor. Matthew!" He opened his eyes. They were the same calm, reassuring blue they had always been, but his voice seemed to come from far away. "Well now," he muttered. He sounded faintly surprised. I got old and never noticed. I worked hard all my life. I'd rather drop in harness." Anne bent her head toward his. Gently, she smoothed the gray hair back from his forehead. "If I'd been the boy you sent for, I could have spared you in so many ways," she said wistfully. He smiled his shy smile at her. She knew every line in the kind face. "I never wanted a boy. I only wanted you from that first day," he whispered. "Don't ever change, Anne. I love my little girl. I'm so proud of my little girl." His eyes closed. "Matthew!" pleaded Anne urgently. "Matthew, don't!" But the breath had gone from his body. Anne gazed down at the still face, the face that for her meant home, comfort, and love. For a long time she knelt there in the long grass, cradling Matthew's body in her arms. 2 days afterward, they carried Matthew Cuthbert over his homestead threshold, away from the fields he had tilled, the orchards he had loved, and the trees he had planted. They carried him to the graveyard, where the mother he had cared for so tenderly was buried. All of Avonlea turned out for the funeral. For the first time, shy, quiet Matthew Cuthbert was a person of central importance. The white majesty of death had fallen on him and set him apart as one crowned. Anne stood by his graveside, her tearless eyes burning in her white face, a dull, throbbing pain aching inside her. People who had loved Matthew wept unashamedly. After the funeral, they came up to Marilla and Anne, pressing their hands, murmuring words of sympathy. But to Anne it seemed as if she stood outside them all, with only the dull ache for company. Sometimes it seemed as if Matthew couldn't be dead. Sometimes as if he had been dead for a long, long time. She longed to be quiet and alone. Perhaps then her tears for Matthew would come. As they left the graveyard, Gilbert stepped forward out of the shadow of the trees. He held his hat in his hands. "Miss Cuthbert, Anne." He looked at each directly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." Marilla's eyes were brimming over with tears. She held them back with difficulty. "Thank you, Gilbert Blythe," she said simply. Anne, too, wanted to thank him. She felt drawn toward his directness and honesty, but she was locked inside herself. Her eyes glanced up at him for the briefest of seconds. Then, taking Marilla's arm, she walked slowly out of the cemetery. In the night, Anne awakened with the stillness and darkness about her. The recollection of the past few days came over her like a wave of sorrow. She could see Matthew's face smiling at her as he had smiled that last time. She could hear his voice saying, "My girl, I love my little girl." Then at last the tears came, and Anne wept her heart out. Marilla heard her and crept in to comfort her. "There now," she murmured, holding Anne closely. "Crying won't bring him back." Anne's voice was choked with sobs. "Let me cry, Marilla. The tears don't hurt like that ache did. Keep your arm around me just for a little while." Marilla rocked her like a child. "I don't know what I'd do if you weren't here, if you'd never come," she whispered into Anne's hair. "I know I've been strict with you, But you mustn't think I don't love you as much as Matthew did. It's never been easy for me to say things out of my heart, but I love you as dear as if you were my own flesh and blood. There, there. For the sobs seemed to increase slightly. It isn't right to cry so. God knows best. Oh, Marilla. Anne raised her tear-stained face. Marilla, what will we do without him? Marilla shook her head wordlessly. Tears rolled slowly down her cheeks. He was always such a good, kind brother to me, she mourned. This time Anne put her arms around Marilla. We have each other now, she reminded her gently. Always there was that aching sense of loss. But even at Green Gables, affairs slipped into their old groove and work was done and duties fulfilled with regularity as before. Then one afternoon, Anne happened to glance out a front window. Marilla was in the yard, talking to John Sadler from Carmody. Anne wondered what he could have been saying to bring that look to Marilla's face. What did Mr. Sadler want, Marilla? She asked, hurrying outside. Marilla fiddled with her apron. She was careful not to look at Anne. He once offered to buy Green Gables, and he's still interested. Anne wondered if she had heard correctly. Buy Green Gables? Marilla! This time Marilla looked straight at Anne. Anne, I don't know what else to do. My eyes are getting worse. Dr. Spencer says if my headaches persist, I may lose my sight completely. What if I can't run this place? Again she looked away. Rachel has kindly offered to let me live with her and Thomas. Anne still couldn't believe her ears. But you can't sell Green Gables. Marilla's worn face was creased with anxiety. I'd go crazy if there was trouble and I was all alone here. I'm sorry that you won't have a home to come to on your vacations. Her eyes scanned the old place, taking in every loved, familiar detail. I never thought I'd see the day when I'd have to sell it, but we'll survive somehow. Anne squared her shoulders. Now was as good a time as any to break the news. You won't have to stay here alone, Marilla, she said resolutely. I'm not going to Redmond. This time it was Marilla's turn to express amazement. Not going to Redmond, she repeated blankly. Why, what do you mean? I'm not going to take that scholarship, Anne explained. I'd already decided, but I hadn't told you yet. Mr. Barry has promised to rent our fields next year, and I'm going to take the school at Carmody. They need a teacher there. Carmody's miles away, objected Marilla. Anne ignored the interruption. I can drive back and forth until the weather gets bad. Then I'll board and come home on weekends. Marilla shook her head. I won't let you sacrifice your education for me. I won't allow it, Anne Shirley. Anne grinned suddenly. Marilla Cuthbert, I am going to do it. I am 16 years old and just as stubborn as you are. So there. Marilla's smile lit up the whole of Green Gables. You blessed girl, she laughed, giving in. I know I ought to stick to it and make you go to college, but I know I can't, so I won't try. I'll make it up to you, though, she added, as she hugged Anne closely. Strolling back into the house together, Marilla looked affectionately at the slender girl by her side. Gilbert Blythe will be teaching too, won't he? She asked suddenly. Anne nodded. Yes, she said briefly. I understand the trustees have promised Avonlea School to him. What a nice-looking young fellow he is, mused Marilla. He looks a lot like his father did at that age. We used to be real good friends, he and I. She glanced over at Anne. People called him my beau. Anne looked up with swift interest. What happened? Why didn't you? We had a quarrel. I wouldn't forgive him when he asked me to. I wanted to after a while. But I was stubborn, and I wanted to punish him first." Marilla shook her head slowly. "He never came back. I always felt rather sorry. I've always kind of wished I'd forgiven him when I had the chance." "So you've had a bit of romance in your life, too," said Anne softly. Marilla smiled. "I suppose you might call it that. You wouldn't think so to look at me, would you? But you never can tell about people from their outsides, now can you?" When it became known in Avonlea that Anne Shirley had given up the idea of going to college and intended to stay home and teach, there was a good deal of discussion over it. Most of the good folks, not knowing about Marilla's eyes, thought she was foolish. Mrs. Lynde did not. She came up one evening and found Anne and Marilla sitting on the front porch in the warm, scented summer dusk. They liked to sit there when the twilight came down and the white moths flew about in the garden and the odor of mint filled the air. "I'm glad to hear you've given up your notion of going to college, Anne," she announced, depositing her substantial person on a protesting wicker rocker. "I don't believe in girls going to college with the men and cramming their heads full of Latin and Greek and all that nonsense." "But I'll be taking my courses by correspondence just the same," replied Anne, laughing. Mrs. Rachel lifted her hands in holy horror. "With all the work you'll have to do, teaching over at Carmody and looking after Green Gables? Marilla," she commanded sharply, "talk some sense into that girl." "Oh, mind your own business for once, Rachel. Leave her alone," retorted Marilla crisply. "You know Anne thrives on studying." Anne left them to their amiable bickering and wandered down the long hill that sloped to the Lake of Shining Waters. It was past sunset now, and all Avonlea lay before her in a dreamlike afterlight. How greatly things had changed since she had returned from Queen's so full of hope and ambition and gladness. It had been shortly after Matthew's death that Anne had first realized that Marilla's eyesight was in danger. That same evening, she had sat by her bedroom window, alone with her tears and her heaviness of heart. It had been a hard decision to make, but she had looked her duty frankly in the face and found it a friend. Before she went to bed, there was a smile on her lips and peace in her heart. Now, as she felt the freshness of the wind against her cheek, a wind that had blown over honey-sweet fields of clover, she felt no regret for Redmond College. She knew her decision to stay had been the right one. Halfway down the hill, she saw a figure approaching her on horseback. It was Gilbert Blythe. "Miss Cuthbert said I would probably find you here," he said, dismounting and holding out a letter. Mystified, Anne read the letter. It took her a while to grasp its meaning, for the letter agreed formally to a suggestion put forward by Gilbert Blythe that Anne Shirley be engaged to teach at Avonlea Public School. "I took the liberty of speaking to the trustees about an exchange," Gilbert explained. "I'll be getting Carmody and you can stay at Green Gables." He took Anne's breath away. I don't know what to say," she stammered. He smiled. "Don't say anything." "But you'll have to pay for your board. You'll never save enough for college. No, I can't let you." "I'll save enough," replied Gilbert steadily. "Besides, I'll keep up with my studies by correspondence." "Why, that's what I'm going to do!" exclaimed Anne in surprise. She held out her hand to him. "Gilbert," she said, her cheeks slowly flushing scarlet, "thank you for giving up the school for me. It was very good of you, and I want you to know that I appreciate it." Gilbert took the offered hand readily. "I figure you can give me some coaching and we'll call it a fair exchange." Anne laughed and tried unsuccessfully to withdraw her hand. "Aren't you afraid I might break another slate over your head?" she asked shyly. He reached out and gently touched an auburn curl, which the wind had set dancing. I'm more worried I might break one over yours." He grinned. Then, taking his horse's reins in one hand, he put his other arm around Anne's shoulder. "Come on, Carrots," he said teasingly. "I'll walk you home." Marilla looked curiously at Anne when she entered the kitchen. "Who was that came up the lane with you, Anne?" "Gilbert Blythe," answered Anne, vexed to find herself blushing yet again. "I didn't think you and Gilbert Blythe were such good friends that you'd stand for half an hour at the gate talking to him," said Marilla with a slow smile. "We haven't been. We've been good enemies, but we've decided to be good friends in future. Were we really there half an hour?" There was a teasing gleam in Marilla's eye. "I've never known that clock to lie, not since Matthew brought it home from Carmody. It seemed just a few minutes, but you see, we've years of lost conversations to catch up with, Marilla." Anne sat long at her window that night, companioned by a glad content. The stars twinkled over the pointed firs in the hollow, and the wind purred softly in the cherry boughs. Her horizons had closed in since the night of Matthew's death, but if the path set before her feet was to be narrow, she knew that flowers of quiet happiness would bloom along it. Nothing could rob her of her birthright of fancy or her ideal world of dreams. "God's in his heaven," whispered Anne softly. "All's right with the world." The end.